Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News for this Good Friday. On this special edition, we're looking back at some of the stories that recently made headlines, starting with the Vatican repudiating the centuries-old Doctrine of Discovery. As Sav Jonza reports, they didn't really go very far.
After numerous calls to rescind a 15th century doctrine, the Vatican stopped short of that today. Instead, they repudiated the doctrine's concepts as never been considered expressions of the Catholic faith. The Doctrine of Discovery is widely known as a tool of colonization, used to justify Christian conquest of indigenous peoples and take their lands. Written in 1493, the doctrine asserts that European people and culture are superior to all others. Indigenous peoples in Canada have been calling for the modern Vatican to rescind it, cries that grew louder during the Pope's visit in July 2022. Rose LeMay, CEO of Indigenous Reconciliation Group, says that visit played into today's announcement.
I do actually think that the Pope has been choosing to do his own learning journey. He spent quite a while on the lands of what we now call Canada, hearing from survivors of residential schools, which were completely enabled by the Doctrine of Discovery. And I think it took him some days and weeks to come to that point of admitting it was a genocide. This is a difficult learning journey. When one has been told through the traditions of centuries that, quote, we're doing the right thing, it takes a while to come around to the fact that, no, actually, this was not a good thing. There was nothing good about it.
Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller had this to say.
Is important. I think over time the Catholic Church has turned its mind really to doing right by Indigenous peoples. They are making strides, and like Canada, probably making some mistakes as well. But I think it is important to recognize the work that got put into making this happen, and it doesn't come overnight. It doesn't come without the advocacy of Indigenous groups or work within the Vatican. So very historically significant, and I believe it is truly an important step in recognizing the harm that's been done by acknowledging the impact of these papal bulls.
Sav Jonza, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
For more on this announcement, we convened our Truth and Politics panel. We spoke earlier with Carrie Benjo, the editor of Eagle Feather News, and Nigon Sinclair, a columnist at the Winnipeg Free Press and a University of Manitoba professor. Carrie, Nigon, great as always. Carrie, let's start with you. What do you make of this, and what does it mean?
I'm still stunned. I wasn't expecting it, but I'm just looking at the next steps. For a lot of people, I think they're still just going to be taking in the information, because this has been a long-standing demand by Indigenous people. When the Pope visited this summer, there were signs saying, rescind the Doctrine of Discovery. This is something that has been actively pursued for decades, and now to have some sort of movement on it, I think people are just right now just absorbing it, and so am I right now.
Yeah, no kidding. Nigon, your thoughts on this, and any idea on the timing of it?
I think it comes on the heels of the visit from last summer. It's evidence that this is the most progressive Pope in history, trying to move what is a historically slow organization. To have something that this quickly to change within a year, we think back to just a year ago during the apology. I think that the Vatican thought this is enough, coming all the way to Canada to make an apology. But what they saw and what they heard and what they experienced was that it needed to go much farther. The apology needed to do more, and part of that was rescinding the Doctrine of Discovery. But we're not quite there yet, and whether they rescinded or repudiate, people have been talking about that language. It really doesn't matter, because what it does is it places pressure on the federal government to do something about this, because the fact is that the Catholic Church has thought that the Doctrine of Discovery has been ineffectual and somewhat wrong for a period of years now, but it's governments that return stolen land, not the Church.
Carrie, do you think now with the apology, the repudiation, do you think any of this, that we're heading down the road now to compensation?
I think we see movement. I wasn't quite expecting, like Nigan said, such quick movement on this work, the work on the doctrine. I can now see this actually happening, compensation actually coming forth, because for years I didn't think this was going to happen, and it happened. And so next step, I think, will probably be compensation, hopefully.
Right. Nigan, as you mentioned, some talk around the language, whether it's rejecting, repudiating. The government of Canada has also rejected the Doctrine of Discovery. So is this move largely ceremonial?
Well, like most things, I spoke to a reporter this morning, and I said, like most things with Indigenous peoples, it's fine and good to say whatever you want, but to take action on those things is the significant part. It's taken over 500 years for the Catholic Church to see us as human beings. What that means is to recognize that we have rights alongside, while we have different laws and governments, ways of doing things than European nations. It's taken Canada just as long to do that. Since the first moment of Canada, which has been built on the Doctrine of Discovery, by simply saying, oh, well, it doesn't have any purpose, or it's useless, or it's wrong, doesn't mean that Canada then turns around and returns all of the land that's been stolen. I said just a minute ago that the Catholic Church can't force the government to do so. The Catholic Church can take action and return the fact that they are on stolen land, return those lands which they've been given ownership to by the federal government to run things like residential schools, and give those back to First Nations. On top of that, the government can recognize Indigenous nations as equals, as partners in Confederation, and then, for the most part, realize that the Constitution is built on a racist premise that Indigenous peoples under Section 91 are to be controlled by the federal government. That's a direct cause from the Doctrine of Discovery. So yes, of course, you can say, oh, the Doctrine of Discovery is useless, but then you have to change the laws. You have to return the stolen land. And yes, the issue of compensation, restitution, revitalization, all has to come to the table.
Kerry, Nigan, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you both taking some time as always. And Nigan, safe travels.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks so much.
Thanks.
For the last 20 years, a photo was the only image of a Mi'kmaq regalia on display at a cultural centre in Millbrook, Nova Scotia. Now, after sitting in an Australian museum for 130 years, that regalia is coming home. Angel Moore has that story.
This is a photo of Mi'kmaq regalia on display at the Millbrook Cultural and Heritage Centre. Heather Stevens was a student at the centre about 20 years ago and asked where the real regalia was.
Because at first I was told it was none of my business. And so me being a First Nations woman being told, you know, it's not none of your business, well, it is. So when I actually took over the management position here, that's when I started to take that role on. I'm like, yes, it is my business. I'm going to move forward and I'm going to get this back.
Today, Stevens is the manager of the centre, and next week she is flying to a Melbourne museum to bring the regalia home.
It's been a very long time that that I was working on this. So bringing it home has been a long journey, and to have it here for our people is so meaningful.
Repatriating the regalia included Stevens appearing at the Canadian Heritage Committee 5 years ago for C-391, an act for a national strategy for the repatriation of Aboriginal cultural property. The act was tabled and dropped when an election was called, but Stevens persevered.
Again, and that's when I knew I have to spearhead this. I have to get this piece back home. And so I've done it.
Stevens says the regalia, made by a Mi'kmaq woman from the Sbaganagati or Millbrook First Nation during the 1840s, was commissioned by Samuel Haigu, a Canadian civil servant who died in Australia in 1891. He left the regalia to Museums Victoria, where it has been stored for the last 130 years.
Because a lot of our artifacts are actually stored in drawers. that nobody is able to see. And that's not what our ancestors would have wanted.
Stevens, working with experts, says the regalia will be protected, as well as any museum.
It is an understatement for our Mi'kmaq people about not being able to know how to care for things, and if they're in a certain museum right now, leave them there because they know how to do it properly. That is a misconception altogether. So we have the technology here to be able to do that.
The repatriation will include ceremony. A specialized case to preserve the regalia will be the featured display at the center.
So having it here not only means having people come in and share our history with us, but it also starts to have the spiritual, cultural connection to our ancestors.
The regalia is expected to be revealed to the public in ceremony on National Aboriginal Day, July 21st. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Millbrook First Nation.
Coming up after the break, we'll look back on our series on the issues facing Kenora's unhoused. Stick around. Welcome back to this special edition of APTN National News. In northwestern Ontario, Kenora nonprofit groups are calling for more action to help the city's unhoused population. They say permanent shelter and support for mental health are desperately needed after 5 overdose deaths happened in just 2 months. In a 3-part series from February this year, APTN's Sav Jonesa and Tamara Pimentel brought us those stories.
Among the tourists and bustling downtown streets of Kenora, Ontario, are the unhoused. Those living on the streets say they feel shamed by the rest of the community, making it difficult to access basic needs like housing and medical care. APTN News met with people experiencing issues firsthand. But what brought us here was the overdose deaths of multiple people in just 8 weeks. 24-year-old Benjamin Littletree O'Cheek died on January 19th this year.
He was a really nice kid, though. Like, he really looked after the underdogs. He was an incredible athlete.
His mother, Marguerite Hunt, lives in Victoria, BC. She says she spoke with her son 5 days before he died, but found out about his death through Facebook. Hunt says Littletree moved back to Kenora with family in 2019 before living on the streets.
He came into the world with a lot of trauma. Unfortunately, his dad and I were both 60 scoopers, and I feel like now that I had to sit with everything and sit with his death, looking back on who he was as a little person and how he had to deal with 2 parents that had no idea how to really self-regulate their own trauma.
She says racism and intergenerational trauma led to Littletree facing addictions, then homelessness.
Our country's inherent racism towards Aboriginal people, and not just Aboriginal people, but addicts, people in poverty. Canada just really wants to just hide that away. We're friendly here, we're kind, but we don't want to talk about the history.
Kenora, Ontario Provincial Police responded to Littletree's death. He was found unresponsive behind the ticket booth for MS Kenora, a local tourist boat that operates in the summer. OPP said it was a sudden death and deemed non-suspicious.
This is around the 67th or 68th friend that has passed away from addiction.
Miranda Elder is a peer support worker with Kenora Moving Forward. The not-for-profit organization sounded the alarm on the deaths over Facebook, saying 5 happened in 8 weeks and went unnoticed by most of the community.
It feels like we're all living in like a Russian roulette type situation where we never know who's going to be next.
Really hope that these deaths in Kenora don't go unnoticed. These were people that could have had a future, had somebody address their trauma and treated them like they weren't a problem.
The deaths have prompted an outcry for change.
But really, people are using this street as their housing.
Advocates say first and foremost, housing or some sort of shelter is needed in Kenora.
So many deaths that could have been prevented already. Right?
In our next story, we hear from James Nicanapanis of Grassy Narrows, how he ended up living on the streets and his constant struggle to put a roof over his head.
My last known fixed address would be the Kenora District Jail or just out here on the street.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Kenora.
For people living on the streets in Kenora, finding a place to live seems impossible. With limited space at the only emergency shelter and being publicly banned from some affordable housing. Here again are Sav Jonesa and Tamara Pimentel.
James Nicanapanis of Grassy Narrows doesn't have a lot to his name, but his belongings stay organized despite times of uncertainty. He's lived on the streets of Kenora for roughly 7 years.
My last known fixed address would be the Kenora District Jail or just out here on the street.
We met him where the majority of Kenora's most vulnerable spend their Friday evenings, at St. Albans Church. A place to get a hot meal, take part in activities, and connect with their street family. But during the later hours, when the church is closed, there aren't many options for a warm, good night's sleep.
Gotta tough it out to the next day. And right now for the winter, I usually make a little fire. You know, I'll burn newspaper or whatever, or make a little homemade shelter, right, wherever we could.
The Kenora District Services Board offers funding for affordable housing and the only overnight emergency shelter in the city. It has 44 beds, compared to the roughly 250 that are unhoused. And the Fellowship Center is only open during the daytime hours. One of the most affordable options would be the historic Kenrisha Hotel, a prominent building of Kenora's skyline.
So we're going to go across the lights.
But walk past and you'll see a list of banned residents, 111 names of unhoused people.
Every single person's name is on that for the entire public to consume. So if you're on that list, you try and get a job, or you try to, go to a storefront and recognize your name is on that list. You're not going to receive service here.
Dr. Johnny Grech is a physician with the Sunset Country Family Health Team. He helps provide outreach and street medicine to people like James. He says solving the housing shortage in Kenora can curb an ongoing overdose crisis by giving addicts a warm, safe place to work on their recovery.
5 overdose deaths in the last 6 or 7 weeks here. 20 HIV cases since January 2022, when we hadn't really seen HIV here for a long time, and very little new housing options. Kind of makes you think we're at breaking point.
Back at St. Albans, Nicanapanis says the Kenrisha banned list impacts the entire street community.
Basically, everybody that you've seen here in this room or building today, everybody's name would be on there.
APTN spoke with the Kenrisha owner, Fidel Chidiak. He declined an interview and wouldn't clarify why the list is posted outside the hotel. We asked people on the streets what they think needs to be done to support the unhoused. Shelter is the big one. The other is harm reduction.
So many deaths that could have been prevented already, right? I mean, if we had a safe injecting site, that could have prevented a couple. Like I said, we're together as a whole. We're all like a street family, right? A lot of that could have been prevented with others just being around each other while they were using, right?
In our third story, accessing medical care while homeless.
If this is where people feel that their medical needs are being met, and this is what I'm worth, it kind of makes you think that I'm kind of worthless.
A hospital here just doesn't seem like I'm important enough, I guess.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Kenora.
Part 3 in our series on the unhoused in Kenora is coming up right after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. The street community in Kenora say they feel shamed for being addicts and facing their addictions. And medical professionals are left scrambling to provide them with proper health care. Tamara Pimentel has part 3 of our story.
Other people that actually lived in the block.
Born and raised in the Kenora area, Lana Ogama spent part of her life on the streets facing her own addictions. Now she's a community support worker doing outreach and harm reduction on those same streets.
There's always some type of racial or discrimination, but it's inevitable living here.
But despite her success in recovery, she says she still faces discrimination, especially when accessing health care. She told APTN about a time she underwent surgery in Kenora.
I felt I had enough courage and built myself up the day before to be honest with them. When I told them that I was in recovery and that I used to be a drug addict, it's like their whole demeanor and the way they looked at me just changed.
Here in the Fellowship Center, a central gathering place, this storage room is in high demand when people need to see a doctor.
So people will come, they'll get their blood test, they'll have a consult with me. We've been trying to have a social worker in here as well, and somebody with lived experience, so the whole team is here. And then it's just constant traffic, effectively.
Dr. Johnny Grech is a family physician, but offers care at this makeshift clinic. He says most of the street community would rather come here than a local doctor's office.
We offer a clinic here every week, but it's not really fit for purpose. I worry that if this is where people feel that their medical needs are being met and, this is what I'm worth, it kind of makes you think that I'm kind of worthless.
5 unhoused people died in 8 weeks over December and January. Dr. Grech says limited housing leads to drug use. The only options for a warm space are the Fellowship Center during the day and one overnight shelter with very limited space. 44 beds for the roughly 250 unhoused.
So for many people, the choice is, I'm going to stay awake all night. You don't want to die of exposure, because that very much is likely to happen if you're in the -20s to -40s. If you smoke or if you inject with meth, at least that kind of keeps your body awake for that much longer.
Ogama says her next visit to a doctor will likely be in Thunder Bay or Winnipeg, where no one will know about her dark past. But she keeps her spirits up to spread positivity to the people she helps.
I try to be happy because there's already people out here feeling low and stuff, and instead of feeding into that, be the opposite of it. When you're not happy, just smile, because it's going to make you smile anyways.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Kenora.
And that's all the time we have for this special Good Friday edition of your APTN National News. For news anytime, though, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Have a great night.